One person in particular deserves credit for today's event, and that is a member of the Athenaeum Writing Committee, a terrific poet himself, Blake Campbell, who helped he was instrumental in getting Vijay here. Blake's I'm grateful to you, Blake, for making this possible. And I'm actually going to turn things over to Blake now so he can introduce Vijay and get the program started. Blake.
Thank you, JD. And thank you everybody for coming out today. I'm pleased to be moderating this belated centennial celebration of Wallace Stevens's groundbreaking first book of poems, Harmonium, released in 1923. It's one of a handful of books from that astonishing decade that made American poetry what it is today. And as we look at some of the poems from the collection, we're going to consider what makes them stand out among the abundant talent of their time and why they continue to resonate with readers today. I'm grateful to Vijay Seshadri for making the trip up from New York City to join us. Vijay was born in India in 1954 and moved to America at the age of 5. He is the author of the poetry books Wild Kingdom, The Long Meadow, The Disappearances, 3 Sections, and That Was Now, This Is Then, as well as many essays, reviews, and memoir fragments. His work has been recognized with a number of honors, including the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, and he teaches at Sarah Lawrence College. So without further ado, Vijay Seshadri. Thank you.
Thank you, Blake, and thank you, JT, both of you for the invitation. Blake and I were talking about how the 100th anniversary of Harmonium sort of passed relatively unnoticed, considering how important the book it is, and hopefully we can start to rectify that here. And I want to say that we did drive up, my wife and I, from New York. We went through Connecticut. Just the country that Stevens makes mythological, so we saw all those places. We went through New Haven. When we went through Hartford, I honked twice. What I thought then was I was going to what I thought before we were driving through Connecticut was that I was going to just talk, but then I realized, well, I'm actually going to be taking apart these poems, and it's disrespectful to simply anatomize Stevens. So I thought I would begin by reading one of the great poems from Harmonium.
Could you adjust your microphone up a little
Sure.
bit higher, please? Thank
Is
you.
this better?
A little, even more.
A little more, like that? So should I just get closer? I've always had mic issues. How's that?
Better.
Okay, so I'm going to read Sunday morning, and then I'll talk for a while, and then, and go back to some poems and dissect them a little bit. That's the program. Sunday morning. Complacency is at the peignoir, and late coffee and oranges in the sunny chair, and the green freedom of a cockatoo upon a rug mingle to dissipate the holy hush of ancient sacrifice. She dreams a little and she feels the dark encroachment of that old catastrophe. as a calm darkens among water lights. The pungent oranges and bright green winds seem things in some procession of the dead, winding across wide water without sound. The day is like wide water without sound, stilled for the passing of her dreaming feet, over the seas to silent Palestine, dominion of the blood and sepulture. Why should she give her bounty to the dead? What is divinity if it can come only in silent shadows and in dreams? Shall she not find in comforts of the sun, in pungent fruit and bright green wings, or else in any balm or beauty of the earth, things to be cherished like the thought of heaven? Divinity must live within herself. Passions of rain or moods in falling snow, grievings in loneliness or unsubdued elations when the forest blooms, gusty emotions on wet roads on autumn nights, all pleasures and all pains, remembering the bough of summer and the winter branch. These are the measures destined for her soul. Jove in the clouds had his inhuman birth. No mother suckled him. No sweet land gave large-mannered motions to his misty mind. He moved among us as a muttering king, magnificent, would move among his hinds, until our blood, commingling, virginal with heaven, brought such requital to desire, the very hinds discerned it in a storm. Shall our blood fail, or shall it come to be the blood of paradise? And shall the earth seem all of paradise that we shall know? The sky will be much friendlier then than now, a part of labor and a part of pain, and next in glory to enduring love, not this dividing and indifferent blue. She says, I am content when wakened birds before they fly test the reality of misty fields by their sweet questionings. But when the birds are gone and their warm fields return no more, where then is paradise? There is not any haunt of prophecy, nor any old chimera of the grave, neither the golden underground, nor the isle melodious where spirits get them home, nor visionary south, nor cloudy palm, remote on heaven's hill that has endured, as April's green endures or will endure, like her remembrance of awakened birth, or her desire for June and evening, hit by the consummation of the swallow's wings. She says, but in contentment I still feel the need of some imperishable bliss. Death is the mother of beauty. Hence from her alone shall come fulfillment to our dreams and our desires. Although she strews the leaves of sure obliteration in our paths, the paths sick sorrow took, the many paths where triumph rang its brassy phrase or love whispered a little out of tenderness. She makes the willows shiver in the sun for maidens who were wont to sit and gaze upon the grass, relinquished to their feet. She causes boys to pile new plums and pears on disregarded plate. The maidens taste and stray impassioned in the littering leaves. Is there no change of death in paradise? Does ripe fruit never fall? Or do the boughs hang always heavy in that perfect sky, unchanging yet so like our perishing earth? With rivers like our own that seek for seas they never find, the same receding shores that never touch with an articulate pang. Why set the pear upon those riverbanks, or spice the shores with odors of the plum? Alas, that they should wear our colors there, the silken weavings of our afternoons, and pick the strings of our insipid lutes. Death is the mother of beauty, mystical, within whose burning bosom we devise our earthly mothers, waiting sleeplessly. Supple and turbulent, a ring of men shall chant in orgy on a summer morn, their boisterous devotion to the sun. Not as a god, but as a god might be, naked among them like a savage source. Their chant shall be a chant of paradise, out of their blood returning to the sky. And in their chant shall enter voice by voice, the windy lake wherein their Lord delights. The trees like seraphim and echoing hills, the choir among themselves long afterward. They shall know well the heavenly fellowship of men that perish and of summer morn, and whence they came and whither they shall go, the dew upon their feet shall manifest. She hears upon that wide water without sound the voice that cries, the tomb in Palestine is not the porch of spirits lingering. It is the grave of Jesus where he lay. We live in an old chaos of the sun, or old dependency of day and night, or island solitude unsponsored, free of that wide water, inescapable. Deer walk on our mountains, and the quail whistle about us their spontaneous cries. Sweet berries ripen in the wilderness, and in the isolation of the sky, at evening, casual flocks of pigeons make ambiguous undulations as they sink downward to darkness on extended wings. That, I encountered that poem when I was about 16 years old. I've been reading Stevens ever since. I bought this book in 1971. It's been everywhere with me. It went with me to the Bering Sea one winter. And you can see that this spine is sort of broken. So Stevens has been a continual presence in my life as a poet and as a reader. I don't know if he's ever been an influence, and he's someone that for a long, long time I took for granted. And then when Blake and the Athenaeum invited me to talk about him, he suddenly became alive, not only because of that invitation, but because Stevens happens to be very alive right now. And in a way that he didn't expect. And I'm going to address that in these typed out remarks I have. And then I'm going to talk about some poems. And I thought in the service of keeping the different things I have to say about Harmonium in some semblance of what is a central Stephen allegiance, the allegiance to order, that I begin in ordering and framing with my own experience now and then of his poetry. As I said, now Stevens has come to life for me in a sort of fruitful crisis. And in the 50 years that I've appropriated his poetry and sort of had him as a presence in my mind, at this moment, I feel that the presence is extremely unstable. I came across a term in some of the recent Stevens criticism I was looking at in preparation for this talk. The term is unanticipated reader, meaning, and I'm simplifying here, generally a reader whose responses weren't, and maybe couldn't have been, imagined by the writer when the writer was writing. And specifically in Stevens's case, the reader who interrogates him in our present with our tendency to presentism. And presentism is the tendency to transpose figures from other historical contexts onto our own and to judge them by our differing interpretive apparatus and moral commitments. And that has happened to Stevens in the past decade or so when it comes to his political attitudes and prejudices, and more specifically, his racial attitudes. exhibited in a few sharp and hurtful and indelible moments in the vast Stevens phenomena. Moments that have been made a lot of in recent writing about Stevens. And have caused our relationship as a collective poetic culture to become a little destabilized because of those moments. And, I don't ever like myself finding it I don't ever like finding myself at what Lionel Trilling once called the bloody crossroads where literature and politics meet. And it's a very uncomfortable place to meet. And what interests me about the recent interrogations of Stevens is not necessarily the debate and the readjustment itself and the attempt to resituate him in a new American understanding. What interests me, and this is Stevensian of me, because Stevens's fundamental reality is the reality of the imagination out of which the world springs. Now, what's interesting to me is the extent to which I've changed from being an anticipated reader of Stevens, a reader he could have imagined in some way reading him, to being an unanticipated reader of Stevens, or rather being now both an anticipated and an unanticipated reader of Stevens, simply through the passage of time. And the extent to which my imagination is reconstituting Stevens is sort of the basis of the things I have to say about the poems. And I feel I have to be careful here in explaining what I do and do not mean. I don't mean that somehow I have been made aware of something about Stevens I was unaware of, alienated from something in him that I was not alienated from 50 years ago. All of us who came out of and were radicalized by the American 1960s, and were also Stevens readers, knew exactly who Stevens was, even if we saw him in this regard as a fairly common type of his era when it came to his social attitudes. We did give him the benefit of his time and place, and we also circumambulated to a certain extent. We relied to a certain extent on what we saw as an absolute a difference as possible between the person who lived and the person who wrote. And if we didn't necessarily go whole hog for the idea of art for art's sake, we could feel the pull, even the predominance of that conviction. And that idea allowed us to deflect our attention to the undeniable pleasure and beauty of the poems. We were the anticipated readers whose education, historically determined and driven, more capacious than humanistic education has been in the intervening decades. We were the anticipated readers who had an understanding of the complexity of the relationship between art and life. Just to give an example, other than myself, to give illustrious examples, we might have been and were Adrienne Rich, who was a tremendous, lover of Stevens. We might have been and still are Robert Haas. Those are two significant poets of the past 50 years who revered and revere Stevens, though their social attitudes were the opposite, or largely the opposite of his. And I didn't, in my first readings of Stevens at 16, 17, 18, when my favorite Stevens poems were ones like Sunday Morning and Peter Quince at the Clavier and A Postcard from the Volcano and Esthétique du Mal and The Well-Dressed Man with the Beard, think of Stevens from the point of view of my own social and racial and political identity. And I never, ever bothered to ask what he might have thought of me if he had encountered me, not wanting or caring to know. And it's not as if I challenge his writing with those elements now. It's not as if I reduce myself to my identity in order to read Stevens. What I recognized in him then was the utter and unique mastery of what we in fact shared and still share and worship together, which is the English language. What I recognized then was a very great poet, and what I recognize now is an even greater poet, an even stronger and more unexampled poet. He's grown in my estimation, the more problematic he's become in relationship to the general culture. And that also is a part of the things I want to say about him. Now, a younger contemporary of his, T.S. Eliot, said that the present changes the past. It's a phenomenological paradox, but we immediately understand it's true. When the present becomes past, it becomes a fiction, which we interpret in one way or another. And Stevens, who was so into supreme fictions, instinctively understood something like this. And that kind of interpretive transformation of the things that had happened, sort of force us in some way to reconstitute and renovate, or at least force me in some way to reconstitute and renovate my understanding of Stevens. And and basically what I'm going to do is go through some of the poems now and tell you and explain to you the ways in which I have sort of reconciled myself as an anticipated reader of Stevens with my new discovery of myself as an unanticipated reader of Stevens, as a Stevens who thinks about him and the concept and the context of our present condition and our present situation, and our revision of our understanding of the past for the sake of the needs of our present. Presentism is a problematic way of thinking about history, but it's a kind of necessary condition that isn't limited to our, particular moment. It's always been a part of the way in which we revise our relationship to things that are the most meaningful. It has a particularly dramatic aspect in this moment of tremendous American polarization, but underneath that, it's an ongoing process. And for me, since Stevens is so important to me, this book did accompany me to the Bering Sea in the dead of winter. And I could have died up there. So it's somehow really important for me to kind of think my way through these issues and problems. And I'm going to start with poems. And if you have the packet in front of you, these are all poems from Harmonium, by the way. And how many of you know the history of Harmonium? Do you have a sense of he was 43 when he wrote it. He had gone to Harvard as a special student and left after 3 years. He came to New York and he wanted to be a journalist. I think he graduated in maybe 1902, or he left in 1901 or 1902 and came to New York to be a journalist and to write. He had been writing at Harvard and he'd been the editor of the Harvard Advocate, the literary magazine of the college, and he pursued journalism in New York. And through that period, he was establishing himself somehow in the world. And a part of that establishment was his 7 or 8 years later, after he arrived, getting a law degree. And then going as a lawyer into the insurance industry. And at the same time, being very deeply involved in avant-garde literary circles in New York and artistic circles through connections he had from Harvard. And he was hanging out with the sort of most significant of the revolutionary artists in New York around the time of the war, including, for example, Marcel Duchamp, the great conceptual artist, and in places where he was speaking French. Stevens is You know, they say of Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier that it's the best French novel in the language. And, you could say of Stevens that he's the best French poet in English. Yeah, because he had, although he never set foot in France, he had this tremendous sense of himself as not just Francophile. He says of French that French and English are the same language. He had a sense of a kind of linguistic continuity that is everywhere evident in Harmonium. It recedes later on, you know, and through this period he was writing poetry and he was meeting people, and one of these people he was meeting, among the people he was meeting was William Carlos Williams, who was, you know, a doctor in New Jersey, but also at the center of a poetic project known as Images, along with H.D., Amy Lowell, and Ezra Pound. And this is in the years between, say, 1912 and 1920. And Stevens was a part of that circle. He was on the edge of it. He had another life, which was his life in his growing life in corporate America. And so he didn't get around to publishing a book until he was 43. He'd sort of established himself in the insurance industry. He was a part of the kind of industry that was inventing these new financial instruments, one of which was the surety bond. And the surety bond was an instrument that was used to underwrite and insure most of the major commercial constructions of New York in the 1920s and 30s, including buildings like the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building, the Woolworths Building, some of those great skyscrapers that you still see downtown. And so he was doing very, very high-powered work. It wasn't like T.S. Eliot working at Lloyd's of London and wanting to get out because he was just doing clerical labor. Stevens was, you know, at the heart of American capitalism at one of its most robust periods, you know, one of its most expansive periods, one of its most dynamic. You know, he wasn't a slave toiling away in a basement. He was rising and rising through that structure, and that's kind of very, very important to understanding him. You know, he, for a long, long time, was defined as an aesthete, but he was not an aesthete. He was this, you know, really powerful businessman of an American type that we can still see. And I think that was sort of the beginning of my renovation of him in relationship to this new recognition that there were things that had to be reconciled about Stevens for me in my own mind as an anticipated and an unanticipated reader of him. You know, that at one time I would have left all of my, you know, rather unkind attitudes towards American capitalism aside in order to read Stevens. You know, that I was, you know, I wouldn't have let one contaminate the other, but I kind of felt like, you know, that is not sufficient for me as a reader to continue to read Stevens. I have to think about the way in which I'm divided in relationship to him and think about the way he was divided. You know, one of the things that he had as a very successful executive was an ability to compartmentalize. And, you know, and it dawned on me that that radical compartmentalization was something I should take more seriously, rather than reading the poems as naively as I have, you know, reading them just for the pleasure I got from them. And once I saw the effects of that radical compartmentalization, I couldn't stop seeing it in all of the work that I was looking at and all of the things I was thinking about in relationship to him, how he kind of compelled one world in order to create another kept them separate from each other, but couldn't quite separate them. So at the heart of Stevens, it seems to me now, there is this tremendous conflict that is resolved in all sorts of ways. And the generative energy, and this is someone who was writing great poems well into the 1950s. You know, he was someone who had a level of achievement that was continuous and it seems to be unmarred. You don't really see in Stevens any diminution of this. You kind of
are ready to start again.
Okay, so. Okay, can't remember where I were. But what I will start by saying is that Stevens was divided. You know, and my reconciliation of my now divided, anticipated and unanticipated reader, you know, involves my recognition of the way in which he was divided. That there was an anticipated Stevens and an unanticipated Stevens. And he didn't know which was which. He didn't know if it was the businessman or the poet who was anticipated. And I think that fruitful division is something I see in him now and that I'm going to delineate. And I want to bring in all of those elements that somehow explain Harmonium in the process. The first is what I alluded to earlier, the fact that he was a French poet in English and an English poet in French. And that at least he saw himself as someone writing in a language that was both English and French. And that is, of course, a lot of poets say things that you should take with a grain of salt. You know, it's fine because they're more interested in the sounds they make than anything else. And I think that's true of him too. So there's a way in which to say that English and French are the same language is just nonsense. But there's a way in which you can understand it, and we should give him the benefit of the doubt in that regard. You know, so that division also has a literary aspect to it. He was surrounded by imagists and surrounded by conceptual poets or conceptual artists like Duchamp, and he was surrounded by a kind of detachment from the old order, but he was looking back 30 years when he was writing Harmonium in the major poems to French symbolism. And French symbolism has this fundamental quality, two fundamental qualities. It's a, you know, you can't really characterize it, you have to look at the poets, but, you know, in the mind of its great theoretician, Mallarmé, the impulse of poetry should be to purify language and to free it of its instrumentality as far as possible in order to create evocations of some sort. And Mallarmé was not an abstract artist, he was a concrete artist, and of the sort that Monet was when he painted his water lily sequences. And Mallarmé loved those paintings, and that's what he thought his poetry should be. You know, something that is on the verge of abstraction, but actually represents something, you know, that we can't grasp. Stevens famously says in a poem, in a poem, he says this about a poem, he says, a poem should evade the intelligence almost successfully. That the intelligence has to reach as hard as it can, you know. It should stretch itself completely, and in the process, you know, discard all of the easy, the cheap, the received associations, the cliches of interpretation in order to, grasp the poem. And so that is an aspect of his Francomania, you might call it, that I want to kind of foreground. The other thing I want to foreground in the sense of his division is the extent to which it created a dialectical consciousness. And I think I was talking to one of the audience members,
Shelley.
Shelley. I was talking to Shelley, and she was pointing out narrative elements in Stevens. And I think narrative elements with their linearity are a part of the work, but the whole structure is a dialectical structure, that he's always dealing with things in opposition, that he's always dealing with a certain kind of antithesis, and when he uses that full-blown rhetoric of a poem like Sunday Morning, which there are always these moments that are antithetical. There are always, the bow of winter and the summer wind, those kind of oppositions, those kind of balancings and stuff like that. And that really comes out of dialectical mind. And that dialectical mind comes out of this fundamental conflict, I think. A lot of the vehemence and the violence in Stevens, and I see him now as a very violent poet, has to do, and the political attitudes when they're expressed are violent attitudes. And I'm sure he had to deal with a lot of violence, psychological violence, making his way up the corporate ladder. That there was kind of, that the competition was intense then as it is now, and the demands upon one to get to the very high level he did. He was the vice president of the Hartford Insurance Company, which at that time was the largest insurance company in America. I don't know what its status is now. It's the one that has the stag as its symbol, great, And you kind of think of Stevens in this context as a stag, as this kind of really large, creature with antlers, and so I think that is something I see, and that the sharpness of that is contained within the sharpness of the dialectical mind that is always trying to reconcile itself to itself, and is always trying to find a unity and a synthesis in this dialecticality. And you see it in this poem. And the first one I have, Nuances of a Theme by Williams. Another one of those, Williams was someone he was always related to, thinking about. William Carlos Williams his whole career, because Williams, he identified with Williams. Williams was not an aesthete. He was not a person of the publishing world. He was a doctor in Rutherford, New Jersey. And so Stevens, as a businessman in Hartford, Connecticut, sort of seems to always be thinking about Williams in relationship to actually living in the pragmatic world and, being pragmatic in the world rather than living in an ivory tower in the way that, say, Alan Tate or John Crowe Ransom did. And notice here the difference, and notice here what he's saying. This is a place in which he gives himself up. He's a difficult poet. He is not someone who's going to tell you what he means. He wants the meaning of his poetry to be an aura surrounding the words, rather than something contained within the words, as in a nugget you can extract, But here he is very, very clear about what he's saying. It's a strange courage you give me, ancient star. Shine alone in the sunrise toward which you lend no part. 1. Shine alone, shine nakedly, shine like bronze that reflects neither my face nor any inner part of my being. Shine like fire that mirrors nothing. 2. Lend no part to any humanity that suffuses you in its own light. Be not a chimera of the morning, half man, half star. Be not an intelligence like a widow's bird or an old horse. So that's really interesting, right? He's almost laying out his credo of what a poem should be. The poem is the star. And the star, reflects neither my face, doesn't tell my story, nor any inner part of my being. Shine like fire that mirrors nothing. Lend no part to any humanity. And here is his old argument and conflict and quarrel with Christianity. He grew up Lutheran. I think he later became an Episcopalian, maybe. I don't, At the end of his life, he converted to Catholicism on his deathbed, which is a very strange incident in Stevenson's life. And he was a Catholic in the way that Santayana was a Catholic. His teacher at Harvard, his philosophy teacher, Santayana's Catholicism is described as being, there is no God and Mary is his mother. And I think that's the Catholicism that Stevens was reaching for. Or maybe he came to believe, one doesn't really know. But anyway, here, lend no part to any humanity that suffuses you in its own light. Be not chimera of morning, half man, half star. Be not an intelligence like a widow's bird or an old horse. Half man, half star refers to Jesus. Chimera of morning could also refer to the son of the morning star, Lucifer, in Isaiah. Oh, how thou art fallen, son of the morning star. But it's very, very clear that he's making a sharp distinction here between the impersonal and the personal, and that he is identifying with the impersonal, with the purely transcendent, rather than that mixed thing that Jesus is. The fault lies with an overhuman God, he says in the City tomorrow. A God that made himself human, that's the cause of all our problems. That's why we're suffering and struggling the way we are. So this is kind of a credo in a way for something that develops and develops through Harmonium and then is transformed in various ways through all of the rest of the process. This basic division, the fact that somehow, rather than blending, he has separated the yolk from the white of his consciousness. And then the problem becomes reintegration. Problem becomes the reintegration of the separate cells. And the separation has to be maintained because he is committed to these two things that are radically at odds with each other. A career with tremendous external demands, requiring tremendous discipline, and an activity he does at home, and later, when he goes to his office and has leisure time, that submits to this thing he calls the imagination, the laws of which no one really understands. And they're very interesting episodes in Stevens. Do you all know the famous interaction he had with Ernest Hemingway? he went down, when he made money, he sort of, after he made money, he went regularly to Key West with a friend of his who was a judge. And they were there together, and we don't know much about what happened there. We know some, but he was there, and that was a time in the 30s when Key West was populated by a lot of artists and a lot of writers, and Hemingway among them. And Stevens was at a party, maybe at John Dos Passos' house. And Hemingway was at Key West then, and Hemingway's sister was at the party. And Stevens started berating Hemingway's work, saying terrible things about it, how awful Hemingway was and stuff. And you can imagine Hemingway being a leftist. Stevens at that time in the 30s was very much concerned, I think, with the revolutionary ethos around him, and was not he was not participating in it. Although he says at one point in his letters, well, I'm moving more and more to the left, but moving to the left for him, I don't know what it meant, maybe that he accepted Wendell Willkie in 1940. But anyway, Hemingway's sister hears Stevens, and Stevens and his judge friend are drinking, and he's going off getting wilder and wilder about Hemingway. Hemingway's sister goes and tells Hemingway. So Hemingway comes running from his cottage. And Stevens and the judge are walking out when Hemingway comes up to the door, and Stevens takes a swing at it. And Hemingway was, Stevens was drunk, and by this time he might have been, what, 56, 57. Hemingway was a couple of decades younger. And Hemingway knocks him down, and Stevens gets up again and starts swinging at Hemingway. Hemingway knocks him down again, and he stays down this time. But the interesting part of the story to me is that the next day Stevens went to Hemingway and he said, please don't tell anybody about this, because he was afraid it would get back to the Hartford Insurance Company, that he had a drunken brawl in Key West, Florida, and he was terrified that this was going to affect his career, And by this time, he was already a vice president. So you can kind of see the contradictions there between this incredibly disciplined person living this very disciplined life in a very regimented social order. And then on the other hand, writing these poems and very committed to a career on a massive scale. Right? He was, anything but not ambitious. I mean, he had a very, very high sense of his calling as a poet. And I think the vehemence and the violence and the result of which is some of these very strange political comments he makes come not out of a simple-minded ideology, because it was nothing if not simple, and it was nothing if not complex. But simply the tension between these two elements of himself and the constant need for the imagination to reconcile both elements. Ideas of order, right? That's the name of one of his greatest books. The idea of order is so crucial to him. And the idea of order is something that he's always reaching toward. This is a kind of another way in which I'm reconciling my unanticipated and anticipated reading of it. I have seen more and more the contradictions and the complexities and the tension. And that tension has given me a key to interpretation. He's a difficult poet. He's considered a difficult poet. You can break the difficulty down, but you can never paraphrase him. What he historically was for me as a reader was someone who produced things that were very, very beautiful. and produced situations that were really beautiful, but he evaded me in a way that he is not evading me now. I'm kind of beginning to understand. I will get to the beauty, but I want to get to kind of the realization that I've had of what he is. And it kind of is connected to the poem that is the third poem or the fourth poem in the pack we have, Tea at the Palazzo Fun. One of those nonsense Stevens titles, right? Tea at the Palazzo Fun. Inexplicable, except in the sense that it evokes something. It evokes something in a classical symbolist way. We don't quite understand it. Yeah. And here is another statement of his creed on a more complex realm than the William Carlos Williams poem. Not less because in purple I descended the western day through what you call the loneliest air. Not less was I myself. What was the ointment sprinkled on my beard? What were the hymns that buzzed beside my ears? What was the sea whose tide swept through me there? Out of my mind the golden ointment rained, and my ears made the blowing hymns they heard. I was myself the compass of that sea. I was the world in which I walked, and what I saw or heard or felt came not but from myself. And there I found myself more truly and more strange. What is my experience? It's what my imagination created. What is this world I'm walking through? This world is myself. That seems to be violent and emphatic, right? That seems to be a kind of assertion. It's almost super Nietzschean, who's a great reader of Nietzsche. And this seems to go way beyond, Nietzsche himself. And it's again tremendously I don't know how to put it, but for so long, if you had read Stevens, by giving him the benefit of the doubt, of not placing him in his context, but thinking of him as someone who existed in this other realm, as I did, you would not see what I see in it now. An emphasis, an assertiveness, a determination that has a tinge of desperation to it. I was the world in which I walked, and what I saw or heard or felt came not but from myself. And there I found myself more truly and more strange. Yeah. Lend no part to any humanity that suffuses you in its own life. He famously says at the end of his career about Robert Frost that he doesn't know Robert Frost's work, which is not true. He and Frost were also in Key West in the 30s and hung out together. He says this in the 50s. I don't know Mr. Frost's work. I hear that it is full or said to be full of humanity. Very, very disparaging. I hear it's full or it's said to be full of humanity, So there's that kind of There's something about France that sort of gets under his skin a little bit, even in the 1950s. And those sort of elements are things that I've seen now through all of the poetry, and they give it a power in some sense. You know, one can think about the vehemence of poets, the anger of poets, the hatred of poets, the worst qualities of poets. But in the best poets, those things are transformed in the poetry into something else entirely. You know, that the vehemence of the negative and the dark emotions are given a fantastic structure through the means of the imagination. And I think whatever you would say about Stevens and his politics from this point of view, from our point of view, and we should all remember that, you know, our point of view is as provisional as his was, and as the moments of any period are, that interpretation is constantly changing, and the present is all constantly turning into the past. And we're starting to see new things entirely, you know. I mean, I think there is a lot of Stevens criticism right now that is trying to figure out, you know, what it is about Stevens that fits into the contemporary world, given how significant he has been for the history of poetry in America, and how great a poet he is. I mean, and, you know, I'll stop with the contrasts and contradictions, the divisions, except to point them out as a crisis that produced his poetry, you know, and that crisis was ongoing. He was, on the one hand, someone who wanted to be successful and powerful in the world in a very conventional way, and on the other hand, he wanted to be a very great poet. Those were two powerful ambitions that, you know, he spent his whole life reconciling, and all of the vehemence and the violence of his attitudes towards the world were aspects of that fundamental contradiction, which now seems to run like a fault line through his life for me and through his poetry. And the ways in which he reconciled that fault line are very interesting. Yeah. And those go back to beauty. And the ways in which he couldn't reconcile in those fault lines go back to a kind of desperation. And first I'll talk about the beauty. Blake and I were talking about his blank verse. You all know what blank verse is, right? Unrhymed, dynamic, pentameter. And it kind of arrives in a translation of the Aeneid in the 16th century and becomes a part of Elizabethan drama. And then the meter gets refined and refined and refined and overly refined. And then I think it's restored to a kind of perfection in Stevens. You know, he was the greatest writer of blank verse. He was as beautiful as Tennyson, but more profound in the way he handled the line, I think, as he was more profound than Tennyson in just about every way, although Tennyson is a very great poet. And here, there's a kind of absolute purity and perfection to the versification. And if you just look at, and here's a section from Sunday Mornings, section 2, why should she give her bounty to the dead? What is divinity if it can come only in silent shadows and in dreams? There are two things that are happening in those three lines. One, the rhetorical mood is interrogative, or the grammatical mood is interrogative. And so it creates a rhetorical counterbalance to the versification. The versification is absolutely regular and pure, you know, and the diction is absolutely pure. One of the things that Stevens is not ever is conversation. Yeats is conversational. Elizabeth Bishop is conversational. The Robert Lowell of life studies is conversational. Pretty much all of the poetry, contemporary poetry you read now takes as its rhetorical starting point the conversation. You should speak conversationally, and that is connected to our democratic culture, right? We should speak to each other as people in our poems. But while Stevens might have been skeptical or not skeptical about our democratic culture, he definitely was not interested in conversational diction. He was moving away from conversational diction to a purification of diction. Where the rhetorical representations are made bare and clear, the verse is absolutely perfect. I mean, it's extraordinary how little variation there is in the stressed syllables. They don't go up and down like this. They just flow smoothly and evenly. And the modulations are so slight, but they're also, they're strongly enough to create variation in our ear, while at the same time be giving us a sense of euphony. That's really quite extraordinary. What should she get? Why should she give her bounty to the dead? What is divinity if it can come only in silent shadows and in dreams? Shall she not find in completes of the sun? Okay. Shall she, that's a two stressed syllables, slightly varying, not find in comforts of the sun. All of those are evenly stressed, but they're not monotonous at all. It's really extraordinary how fine his ear is. In pungent fruit and bright green wings, or else in any balm or beauty of the earth, things to be cherished like the thought of heaven. And that wonderful inversion in that line, in any balm or beauty of the earth, things, which is stressed, to be cherished like the thought of heaven. Those little inversions he makes, give the verse variety without ever calling too much attention to themselves. It's so far away from Milton, who's just wrenching everything down, right? He's wrenching everything down. And of course, Milton's verse can be heard here because everybody who wrote blank verse after Milton had to deal with the way Milton wrote blank verse. But here what you're getting is a perfect modulation of that. And the diction contributes to it. The diction is somewhere, it's transatlantic, it's somewhere between here and France, which allows him to purify the language in a way that English poets of his period or of the Victorian period couldn't. Even the ones who were very steeped in French, who were very aware of French. I mean, Swinburne, for example, was very, very aware of French, but he couldn't have done this, sort of meant things to be cherished like the thought of heaven. Divinity must live within herself. Passions of rain or moods in falling snow. Grievings and loneliness or unsubdued elations when the forest blooms. Gusty emotions on wet roads on autumn nights. All pleasures and all pains, remembering the bough of summer and the winter branch. And there's that antithesis, all pleasures, all pains, remembering the bough of summer and the winter branch. These are the measures destined for her soul. And to go back to a deeper level of the beauty of this passage, look at the way in which in the second part of the stanza, abstract nouns are creating tremendous evocative situations for the reader. Passions, moods, grievings, elations, How is he managing to also make us feel so concretely, the gusty emotions on wet roads on autumn nights? We know exactly what he's saying, right? It's the concatenation of those different elements put together that give us evocation. He's creating concretion by using abstract nouns, which is a remarkable thing to do, a remarkable ability he has. to use sort of the loftiest and sometimes the most metaphysical language to create very concrete situations where we're actually feeling what this person is feeling, you know? Yeah. Gusty emotions on wet roads on autumn nights. I mean, you can read those lines over and over again and still not be able to penetrate the secret of the achievement there, the poetic achievement. It's so extraordinary. It's so particular. And, you know, and that's one of the ways he reconciles the differences that he feels inside himself by creating these cathedrals of beauty. You know, these enormous, these stanzas that are just so rich and round and filling. And, you know, and another way he does it, like, look at the stanza I printed out from Le Monocle with the Monocle. Here you have like a classic Mallarmé-like situation. Something is rendered symbolically, and then the poet enters into that symbol and makes it concrete. Yeah. He creates an imaginative structure, and that imaginative structure leads to a world. Yeah. The mules that angels ride come slowly down the blazing passes. Okay, the mules that angels ride, you know, is right out of French symbolism. Right? You can see it in so many symbols. Come slowly down the blazing passes, and suddenly we're back in our world that's been transformed by his imagination. From beyond the sun, dissensions of their tinkling bells arrive. These muleteers are dainty of their way. Now we go from the mules to the muleteers, right? So we're getting deeper. We're taking a symbol and we're making it more real, more concrete, more like the world we recognize. Yeah. Meantime, centurions guffaw and beat their shrilling tankards on the table boards. You know, I've always read this as a kind of winking reference to Yeats. You know, you see people like this in Yeats's poems, right? They're sitting around drinking. Yes. There's something, and after porter drinkers randy laughter. Yeah, very Yeats. Meantime, centurions guffaw and beat their shrilling tankards on the table boards. This parable, in sense, amounts to this. We didn't know it was a parable, but he's already shifted. Within this very, very controlled, beautiful, measured verse, so many things are happening. There's so many transformations and metamorphoses taking place. This parable, in sense, amounts to this. The honey of heaven may or may not come, but that of the earth both comes and goes at once. Suppose these couriers brought amid their train a damsel heightened by eternal bloom. And this is a kind of Victorianism that you find in, and you know, when he isn't French, he's Victorian. I mean, he really is in Harmonium, a damsel heightened by eternal bloom. Yeah. It's like that synthetic language that was created in the late 19th century, that out of sort of the pre-Raphaelites that, you know, a lot of people used for their fantasy fiction in the 20th century, you know, really came out of like William Morris and all those people. And so he's kind of captured by that synthetic language too, you know. But before I move on, this parable in sense amounts to this: the honey of heaven may or may not come. Again, kind of the antithesis there, and the dialectical mind working. You know, it's one thing and it's the other. It's one thing and it's the other, and the intensity of that. But that of the earth both comes and goes at once. You know, again, the dialecticality. You know, suppose these couriers brought amid their train a damsel heightened by eternal bloom. And these kind of prompts. mean, how much time do I have?
We might wanna open it up for questions, so.
Okay.
So it's good.
Well, okay, I had a lot of stuff to say about 13 ways of looking at a blackbird. I'll say one thing and then I'll read the snowman and then we'll open it up to questions. Okay. The one thing I have to say is the 13th stanza of 13 ways of looking at a blackbird. The bottom of the last page of that poem. You all have it. This is one of the miracle moments in Stevens for me. When I saw it, I understood, and it's perfect for the season we're living in. Now, it was evening all afternoon. Yeah. I mean, how many times out of our childhood have we remembered those snowy winter days? Yeah. When it was evening all afternoon. It's such a beautiful perception. Yeah. It's psychological, it's meteorological, you know, it's deeply reminiscent of the way a child thinks. It was evening all afternoon, you know, on a snow day by 2 o'clock. It's like you just feel the pressure of that. It was evening all afternoon. It was snowing and it was going to snow. The blackbird sat in the cedar limbs. Yeah. I've always loved that. It's so just like dynamite to me. And then, you know, the snowman, because yeah, Stevens is divided between the snowy Northeast and Florida. And he's very much a worshiper of the sun. But ultimately, this is where he truly resides, in a kind of desperation, because he can never reconcile those two highly divided aspects of himself. He can never blend the yolk and the egg, and he can certainly never put the egg back into its shell. Snowman. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost in the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place for the listener who listens in the snow, and nothing himself beholds, nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. Anyway, so should we open it up? Questions? Well, my voice is old and hoarse and broken.
All right, well,
You can imagine how loud it was once.
before we open it up to the crowd, I have a question for you about Stevens's professional life at the Hartford Accident and Indemnity Company. So I always, you know, I had this impression of Stevens for a really long time as somebody who was very persnickety about maintaining this divide between his professional life and his life as a poet and as an artist. And I think that Stevens behaved in a certain way during his life to kind of give that impression. And then, but every now and then, like I've come across anecdotes that have you know, told me that have suggested to me that his job actually benefited his verse as well. I mean, in addition to providing him with material comforts and stability, he actually composed his poetry in his head as he walked to work every day. I've read that his secretary actually took them down by dictation. He apparently would often send his secretary to the Hartford Library in the middle of the workday to look up words in the Oxford English Dictionary for him. So like there's perks that come with being like an old rich white guy,
Yeah.
So I kind of thought about this for a while, and then I found, and I don't know what the source, I have to double check the source of this, and I don't know for sure or not. But there's an anecdote in the James Atlas biography of Delmore Schwartz. And supposedly Delmore Schwartz, who was a poet during the 30s and 40s, who Stevens knew and whose work Stevens admired. Apparently, for whatever reason, Delmore Schwartz decided to visit Stevens at his office.
Oh, really?
And he went in there, and the story goes that at some point during the tour of the insurance company, one of Stevens's colleagues pulled him aside and say, Mr. Schwartz, we have a secret. Wallace Stevens is the worst insurance executive in this company. The only reason that we keep him on staff is because he's a great poet. So I don't mean to contradict your scholarship, but I read that and I was floored, and I'm like, why don't more people know about this supposedly happening?
I mean, I'm not a scholar of Stevens. And half of what I told you about Stevens is probably untrue, I just, I say things that I think seem to be true, but I think but I think I'm fairly accurate in my understanding. And the Delmore Schwartz anecdote could not have happened before the 1940s. And at that time, Stevens had come out as a poet. He was definitely, he published Ideas of Order and Parts of a World and The Man with the Blue Guitar. He wrote Harmonium, and then he didn't publish a book again. Harmonium was published in 1923. He didn't publish a book again. He published an expanded edition of Harmonium in 1931, I think. But that was not new work. He didn't publish a book again until Ideas of Order in 1936. And then he published Parts of a World in 1938. And he published pretty regularly after that. And that period from, say, I can't remember exactly what the date was when he went to work for the Hartford, Accident and Indemnity Corporation, which is now the Hartford Health Insurance Company. But it must have been 1919, 1920, and then he published Harmonium. But when he was establishing himself in that world, I don't think he was making it known that he was a poet. I don't think he was necessarily hiding it. And there are anecdotes from that period that people are shocked when they, in the business world, are kind of shocked when they hear that Wally is a poet. They say, "Oh, Wally is a poet?" They call him Wally. I mean, how impertinent of them. Claire?
Yeah, I have a question. Why do you think he chooses a female persona? She sang Beyond the Genius of the Sea, or why should she give her bounty to the dead? It's deliberate. He has the female.
It's absolutely deliberate.
Why?
Go on, my ship, since now upon the shore, the snake has left its skin upon the floor. The moon is at the masthead, and the past is dead. Her mind will never speak to me again. There's always that kind of dialectical opposition between the male speaker and the female who exists in the poem. And that too, I think, is a part of a very sharp difference in his own psyche. In the different elements of his own psyche that have to be reconciled with one another. So, the woman being addressed in the Idea of Order at Key West, she sang Beyond the Genius of the Sea, the water never formed to mind or voice of the body, holy body, fluttering its empty sleeves. That person is a figure of intense, that female is a figure of intense poetic valences for him. And he is not going to tell us why, right?
What's that?
It's not a question of anything personal. It's not even a question of anything Jungian, right? That this is his anima or anything like that. The great ability of Stevens is to hide behind his rhetorical fictions. You know, to create something symbolic, you know, and rather than moving back to the real person behind that symbol, if there were a real person, you know, creating a world out of that symbol and a drama out of that symbol that is self-contained, that cannot be interpreted as anything but itself, you know, I mean, we
I mean,
have
I never imagined a real woman in why should she give her bounty to the dead
sure,
and so forth.
yes, yeah, I mean, I do in the beginning. Complacencies of the peignoir and late coffee and oranges in the
Yeah.
sunny chair, that image, and late coffee and oranges in the sunny chair. You know, I always thought that, you know, I was a 16-year-old, this little Indian kid in the Midwest, I thought that was the height of elegance. The peignoir and the late coffee and oranges in the sunny chair. I mean, speaking of white people, I thought that's the way white people live. Get up and put on their peignoirs and coffee. They get up late, put on their peignoirs, coffee and oranges, that's so cool. No, I didn't mean to racialize this. But
Is he putting a female on some sort of pedestal?
I don't know, you know, there's all this speculation that. Now, you know that Elsie Maul, the woman he was married to, whom he met in Reading, Pennsylvania, was very beautiful, but came from a class of people that his parents disdained because they considered her lower class, lower middle class, you know, was someone he soon became estranged from. She was famously beautiful. She was the profile of the Liberty dime that was minted in what, 1912 or 14 by a famous sculptor whose name is escaping me now. You know, that a bust of her was made, and that was the profile of the Liberty dime. But by the time they had moved to their big house in Hartford, which you can still go visit, I think, and it's still there,
I thought it was on the market.
but it's still standing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not like it's turned into the Wallace Stevens home or anything like that.
And they had a daughter.
They had a daughter, yeah, Holly. Yeah, he famously, I read a letter of his once. He's just outraged. I mean, he was very loving toward his only daughter. But he was very mad at her at this time because she was going out with this guy with an Italian name who was a communist. It's going out, my daughter's going out with a communist. No. But they were estranged. They slept in separate bedrooms. And so there's been a lot of speculation about his sexual life. And there's all sorts of evidence in the poems that seem to suggest that he did have an active sexual life, especially when he was in Florida. And like that poem I quoted from, "Farewell to Florida, go on high ships, its now is on the shore. The snake has left its skin upon the floor." But there's no way people can track it down in natural and any of the facts behind that.
Thank you.
I think, just to kind of add to what you were saying, Vijay, I think he had a very rich internal sexual life.
Yeah.
And I think that comes through in like the final soliloquy of the interior paramour, and I think that interior paramour figure she shows up over and over again, the poems and all these different guys as it's Sunday morning. And Peter Quint's at the clavier. I just, and that's really fascinating to me because again, it was a means of trying to make something out of nothing, like as in the snowman.
Yeah.
I think that erotic frustration was one of the big sources of inspiration for his poetry, and I think some of his best poems came out of or are expressive of that feeling.
Yeah. Yeah,
JD?
definitely.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, you had a comment. Well, in the end of the Tea at the Palazzo Food, I love that last line, more truly and more strange.
Yeah.
I was wondering, actually, I never noticed this before, but I actually thought of so sweet and so cold when I heard that this time from Williams. Well, but could you talk about strangeness in Stevens, and does that sort of fit in terms of? I mean, I thought it's interesting that he ends that poem with that line, and does that connect to what you're?
I think maybe I'm making too much of the symbolist connection. But the theory and the practice is that if you purify the language, right, if you rid it of its dross, of its cliches, of its, of its received ideas. Now, I mean, one of the great heroes of the symbolists was Flaubert, the dictionary of received ideas, the cliches, that period of French culture, they were disgusted with that. And they wanted to move away from it, those people. But the idea is, if you purify the language of its instrumentality, then it will by itself reveal the strangeness of the world. And we know that the world is strange, right? We kind of just understand it metaphysically. I mean, why is there something instead of nothing at all? I mean, it's just it's something we always bump against, but then the language somehow betrays us. And in order to keep the language from betraying us, we have to purify it, purify it, purify it. That's why the diction is now conversational. That's why he's constantly using words that are a little odd when it comes to the lexical range of American speech circa 1920. That's why the titles don't go anywhere. Tea at the Palazzo Food, how does that relate to the poem that follows it? It's a means by which we alienate ourselves from received understandings of language. And once you do that, things reveal themselves in their strangeness, I think. I mean, I think that's what he would say. And that's certainly what Mallarmé would say, that in some sense it's a subtraction, subtracting those elements that are conventional in the way that we speak, that allows the language itself to take center stage as a living thing. And then what the language represents becomes itself strange. Does that make sense in terms of?
I think we should take one more question.
I saw your hand first.
So he has a bunch of poems about nature, but they tend to, they go immediately abstract. Like he's not like a Robert Frost where you can have a picture of stock and here's what I'm talking about. It's, he's already in a fantastical place when he describes nature. I mean, can you speak to a bit about his use of nature and poetry?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was a keen observer of nature. But he wasn't a romantic in his relationship to nature. He was definitely post-romantic. And he was very much a part of that sort of growing idea through the 19th century, which becomes predominant in 20th century philosophy and phenomenology, which says that we, the consciousness constitutes the world. Yeah, the consciousness is more real than the world it is constituted, because it's the necessary half. And the other half, so, that, it was evening all afternoon is, I think, an incredibly beautiful perception of nature in some way. But he's using nature not as sauce to cover everything, but as spice for the poems, right? He's putting a little bit here and a little bit there. And when you get a natural image in Stevens, it's really, it kind of lifts you out of your seat. It's so wonderfully done, but he's definitely not subordinating the poem to nature. And he's definitely not, for a poet like Elizabeth Bishop, who I think is as great a poet as Stevens is, the descriptive is what's the most real, the kind of, and for him, no, he will not linger in that world. He will not, he doesn't come out of any naturalist tradition. And the naturalist tradition is not necessarily the same as kind of an interest in nature. Right? It's actually a literary tradition that comes out of realism. And I don't think Stevens is ever attracted to that. That's why he said what he said about Frost. I mean, Frost is a very great poet too, and Stevens, I'm sure, knew it. But he couldn't really admit it in public.
We probably should wrap up just because of how, but can we all thank Vijay? Please, if you want to come up and chat a little bit about Stevens or poetry, and thanks for coming.